Hey, I want to talk a little bit about the fat acceptance movement. I may have covered this before, but I've just watched a video, Fat Acceptance Cringe. Now, clearly it's meant to be a bit sarcastic and a bit like poking fun at some of these people, which I don't entirely go with. But what I do take issue with is a lot of the self-pity that is involved in the movement, and I want to just talk about that aspect of it. The fat acceptance movement, which is a pretty umbrella term, probably began in the last 20 years, broadly speaking. And it's basically about body positivity. It's about saying there are fat people, deal with it. Now, I want to be very clear. I'm against bullying. I'm against any sort of, making someone feel bad because of the way they look. Against that across the board. I think it's wrong. And overweight kids get a very rough time at school often. And I think people can be cruel. People can be unkind. But I do think that the fat acceptance movement does a lot more harm than good. They say it's all about body positivity, but the video clip I've just seen, there was this girl getting up. She, like, I thought she was going to tell a joke, but then she got into this diatribe, and that's the only way you could describe it, of how awful the world is and how she was speaking about her depression and about self harm and so on, which are serious issues. But her whole attitude was it's everyone else's fault. Here's a fact: being morbidly obese is unhealthy. That's not a bigoted statement, it's just a matter of fact. It puts pressure on your heart, and the average morbidly obese person is shortening their life expectancy. You don't need to be a doctor to see it. It's just a fact. They're putting pressure on their organs, they're putting pressure on everything. It's just common sense. If you're morbidly obese, you're putting your body through you know, an ordeal that shouldn't the human body's not designed for. I understand the issue of body positivity, and actually it's right that there was a backlash against, for example, the fashion industry, which were using super skinny models, and that led all sorts of problems in that direction. But the way I see it is the fat acceptance movement is just as irresponsible as modeling agencies that promote a super skinny image. They're as bad as each other. Both suggest that there's nothing wrong with it. In the case of the modeling industry, it's suggesting an aesthetic that is dangerous and causes a lot of young people, boys and girls, we often focus on girls, actually some young men as well. It causes a huge amount of problems, bulimia, um, other eating disorders. And, I'm no expert on this, but this is just well documented stuff. The way I see it, the fat acceptance movement is saying morbid obesity is fine. And their whole thing is about aesthetics. Like, people are judging me because of the way I look. Sure, people judge, that's human nature. But the real issue there is health. And they get incredibly defensive and self righteous and sometimes quite aggressive, actually, if anyone challenges them about it. I'm sorry, but I'm more inclined to believe a doctor with years of experience than someone who's in denial about their health problem. Um, so I think the fat acceptance movement are very arrogant. I think they think they're doing something positive, but they're not. I mean, there's issues like, particularly in the United States, we've seen legal cases where overweight people have wanted to sue airlines because they couldn't fit onto the plane. But if you're morbidly obese, why should a plane redesign its entire interior because of your lifestyle problems? I appreciate that different people have different metabolisms, but I think very often that's used as an excuse for people who won't take some self responsibility. No, look, I'm not going to be self righteous here and say, oh, I'm the world's most motivated person, I'm the world's most whatever. I have many faults, but I am a believer in self responsibility to a large extent. The world is an unfair place. People can be unkind, people can be unfair. And yes, there is injustice in society. But if your narrative is it's all someone else's fault, that's where I draw the line. I think people are not going to be sympathetic to that. And unfortunately, it's a vicious cycle because people will then look at you in a negative way. They'll think, oh, you're self righteous, you won't take any self responsibility. Then you'll be triggered by the reaction, and it's like a cycle. The only way that ends if you start being honest with yourself and accept that morbid obesity is just not healthy. Forget looks, forget about the aesthetic of it. Think purely in terms of health. If you're morbidly obese and you insist that you're healthy, you're lying to yourself. It's no different from someone who's got a drinking problem and they won't admit it, or someone who has drug problem and won't admit it, or any other problem. And I'm not perfect. I've had times in my life where I've been slack. I've I've never formed a fully. I don't think I've ever got into full scale addiction. Well, I haven't. But there were times I was being unhealthy, and I knew it, and I wasn't doing a great deal to change it because I use it as a coping mechanism. At university, I was deeply depressed about a lot of issues. I was binge drinking badly. Now, it never got to the point of fully blown alcoholism, but I know that I was, relying on it too much. Thankfully, it never got out of hand to the point where I developed alcoholism, but it could have. And I know overweight people. My father's overweight. He won't mind me saying this because he often, he's the first to admit it. But that's the point. That's what I respect about my dad. He doesn't deny it. He doesn't say that it, and he's lost weight. He has made serious efforts to lose weight, and that's good because he's now in his early 60s. But I used to have times when I was seriously worried, am I going to lose my dad in his 50s from a heart attack? So that's another problem I have with the fat acceptance movement. I think they're selfish. They're not considering their relatives. They're not considering if you're a young person, if you're in your 30s, you're morbidly obese, you could well die in your mid 40s. Are you not going to consider how your relatives would feel about that? So I think they're selfish as well. The movement rather is selfish. Um, I'm sympathetic to people struggling with all sorts of issues regarding aesthetics and all, not just aesthetics, regarding body positivity. I'm sympathetic to that. I don't want anyone to get the impression that I'm coming in here cold and judgmental. No, but this is a movement that is quite, it's kind of forcing people to agree with it. So actually, they can complain about being judged, but they are actually imposing their dogma onto everyone else. And they're saying, oh, you have to accept me. And they're threatening to sue companies if they don't conform. Why should a plane redesign some of its seats to accommodate people who are overweight who don't need to be in that situation? It's not comparable to, say, someone who is very tall, because that genuinely cannot be helped. You can lose weight. It's difficult, but you can lose weight. And I'm not trivializing it. I'm not saying it's an easy thing to do, but I don't have much respect for this argument from the fat acceptance movement that accept me how I am. Yeah, that's fine. But don't turn around and blame everyone else and deny the problem. Don't deny the fundamentals of the problem because that's what they do. They'll insist that they're not overweight, or then it gets into the body positivity thing. If they do acknowledge they're overweight, they say it's beautiful. I mean, I could talk about the aesthetics of it. The average person is not attracted to morbid obesity. They're just not. That's just a fact. But even leaving that outside the equation, I've even seen examples of, I mean, when you combine feminism and fat acceptance, that's a pretty toxic combination because then you get militant feminists who are morbidly overweight demanding that men find them attractive. No, ain't gonna work. I don't find morbidly obese women attractive. And that's not why they should change, not to suit me, but for their health. But what you can't do is turn around and say, we demand you find us attractive. No, you can't impose that on people. You just can't. So a lot of these sort of movements are very self-righteous and very, they just won't take any responsibility. So Fat Girl in this clip, I think that fat acceptance cringe, I can understand where it comes from because people do look at it and they think it's rather pathetic. Like you have these people with serious medical problems and they're blaming everyone but themselves. That's where the cringe part comes from. I don't mean to be flippant about it because there is a serious issue here. People are dying young. It's costing health systems enormous. It's kind of ironic in a world where 85,000 children in Yemen may have starved to death. We have movements in developed countries where people are demanding the right to be morbidly obese, and then they complain if any issues come about from even suggesting any sense of self responsibility or acknowledgement. Let me know your thoughts.